Chapter 8, Section 1. Section 8.1 begins by talking about energy, because energy is the main core of everything that we as living things need to do in order to survive. For example, we need energy to move, we need energy to breathe, we need energy to digest our food. So in our textbooks, energy is defined as the ability to do work. Now, according to scientific law, energy is not created, nor can it be destroyed. So then, where does the energy come from? The energy that we need comes from the food that we eat. And there's two main types of organisms that are talked about in regards to where they get their energy, or basically where they get their food from. Autotrophs are organisms that make their own food using light energy from the sun. For example, plants. Plants need sunlight for survival because the light energy is powering the process of photosynthesis so they can make their own food. On the other hand, heterotrophs are organisms that obtain energy from the food that they eat, like us, for example. We are dependent on other organisms for food, so we need those organisms in order to get our energy. Now, what we do with that energy from the food that we eat is basically the same. All organisms have to release the energy in sugars and other compounds, like proteins or carbohydrates, lipids. Now, since we have to release energy, the energy that we release can come in many forms. We can emit light energy, heat energy, electricity. Not us, obviously, for electricity, but other organisms, yes. We can also store extra energy in chemical compounds. There's a special chemical compound that our cells use called ATP. ATP is one of those compounds that can store and also release energy. So, to give you a better idea of how ATP is useful for our cells, there are three important events that ATP powers or gives energy towards. For example, active transport, which we just talked about. When the molecules have to move in the opposite direction from low concentration to high concentration, you need energy to go against the grain. ATP is your energy. For movement, anytime our muscles move, ATP is powering those movements. For making proteins, also known as protein synthesis, we need ATP to power the making of proteins. Now, there is one small drawback for ATP. Our cells only have a small amount of ATP, and ATP is not a good molecule for storing large amounts of energy for a long period of time. It can store energy, but it's a small amount, and it happens in like quick, short bursts. So now let's take a closer look at how ATP works to power these important events, more specifically the process of photosynthesis. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate because it's made up of adenine, ribose, and 3 phosphate groups as pictured in the diagram. The main function of ATP is to provide usable energy for the cell, which is why we nickname it the energy-carrying molecule. Now, within the ATP molecule, the energy is stored in the chemical bond between the second and the third phosphate. Take a look at the diagram. That lightning bolt is meant to represent where the energy is contained within the entire ATP molecule. Now, how does energy get released? Energy gets released when that third phosphate breaks off, leaving a DP and a free phosphate. Now, after that third phosphate breaks off and the energy is released, you are left with a new energy-carrying molecule called ADP, adenosine diphosphate. You still have your adenine, you still have your ribose, but now you have 2 phosphates instead of 3. It still carries energy, but it has less chemical energy compared to ATP. Okay, so here's a quick version of how, once again, ATP releases energy. The third phosphate, this third phosphate, breaks off, releasing the energy, and now you are left with ADP and that free phosphate. Now, this is a continuous cycle. ATP is constantly going to release energy and also store energy. So there's a consistent transformation between ATP and ADP plus P, ATP and ADP plus P. So in order to help with this transformation, we have our good old friend, the enzyme. A special enzyme called enzyme ATPase helps to break off the third phosphate and to put it back on. You have this version of the ATP cycle in your note guide. Enzyme ATPase is there, once again, to help break off that third phosphate and to put it back on. Take a close look at that ATP cycle. You will be responsible for knowing how to draw it and also how to label it correctly.